And you can go ahead, Jen.
Great, thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Community Outreach and Engagement Seminar Series. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Abbie Begnaud, who is an associate professor in the School of Medicine. She's in the Division of Pulmonary, Allergy, Critical Care, and Sleep Medicine. Dr. Begnaud did her undergraduate training at the University of Miami. She then went to medical school at Louisiana State University Health Sciences Center, did her internship and residency at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and then a fellowship at the University of Florida. She was then recruited to join the faculty at the University of Minnesota in 2013. While in her faculty position at the university, she works in advanced diagnostic and therapeutic procedures, and she's also part of a collaborative team that launched the University of Minnesota Health Lung Cancer Screening Program. Her research interests are in implementation and dissemination of lung cancer screening, and primarily the use of lung cancer screening to help reduce health disparities in lung cancer. So today she's going to talk to us about her community engaged work around using lung cancer screening to reduce health disparities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Begnaud.
Thank you, Jen. I hope everyone's a little patient with me today. I'm feeling under the weather, but some makeup and medications, and hopefully I can make it look pretty good. I'm certainly happy to talk with you about this topic. I was asked specifically to talk about one of the studies that we did, so I'll talk about a few different things. I do have a plan, to give you a little bit of background. I mean, this is not really a talk about lung cancer, but I have a few pieces of background information that I think will be beneficial to understanding the context of the work that I have been doing. So lung cancer in Minnesota, the burden of lung cancer that is borne, both incidence and mortality for the Indigenous population, American Indians and Alaska Natives living in Minnesota, is about twice that of white Minnesotans. Survival for lung cancer in general is pretty poor. The 5-year survival for lung cancer is about 20% these days. Lung cancer is making a lot of important strides in terms of treatment and personalized medicine and improved diagnostics, but survival still remains rather poor. And most lung cancers are attributable to cigarette smoking, although there are other recognized risk factors that we know about. So lung cancer histology, about 80% of lung cancer is considered non-small cell. Many of you probably are aware of this. You know, small cell cancers exist kind of on a spectrum of neuroendocrine tumors and are very aggressive. Non-small cell tumors are further divided into histologic subtypes. Adenocarcinoma, squamous cell, and large cell are the most common. Again, we're going to get into, just want to make sure everybody has this basic understanding. You may already know this. So a little bit about Indigenous peoples living in Minnesota. Minnesota recognizes unique sovereignty and the sovereign status of 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota. There are over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States, but there are 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota. And Minnesota actually has a relatively larger proportion of Indigenous peoples compared to some other states. So there are about 60,000 American Indians and Alaska Natives living in Minnesota, which is about 1% of our population. The Phillips neighborhood of Minneapolis is actually the third largest urban American Indian population in the United States. So although a small percentage of Minnesotans, we do actually have a sizable portion of Indigenous peoples, again, compared to some other states. So this is geographic and background distribution of the 11 tribes in Minnesota, and the color code tells about the traditional origins of those groups. So Anishinaabe and Dakota and communities. And I want to put a word in here about tobacco, commercial tobacco use, and traditional tobacco use. You know, the dilemma is basically that traditional tobacco use for prayer and ceremony is necessary. This is from a paper which I really love. We know some of the authors of this paper, and I think it's really vital to understanding anyone who's doing work that is in health conditions that are related to tobacco or even taking care of Indigenous peoples, and understanding the distinction between commercial tobacco and traditional tobacco. But essentially, traditional tobacco was a different plant and used differently. Colonial practices and separation prevented access to the traditional plants for healing and prayer purposes. And so commercial tobacco has supplanted and was replaced, which leads to high rates of commercial tobacco use and dependence and causes great harm. And I'll just read a couple of these quotes from this paper. The citations on the bottom, this is a publicly available peer-reviewed article. Carol, who is a close friend and collaborator of ours as an Anishinaabe, and she says it's important to understand that traditional tobacco will always remain in use by Minnesota Indian tribes. Tobacco is one of the first gifts from the Creator. Its use by Minnesota Indian people is a means of spiritual connection offered during prayer. Children are taught at a very early age the importance of offering tobacco, and it's not uncommon for children to have a pouch of tobacco readily available. Tobacco is sacred to me, my family, and Minnesota American Indians. Our use of tobacco will continue. And then Kathleen, who is Dakota, says, when tobacco is burned, the smoke rises, which provides us a link to all the spirits beyond the sky and to our Creator. Tobacco in its original form has an honor and a purpose that did not contain all the chemicals that are now put into commercial tobacco. Traditional tobacco is a healer. It shows us wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. So we have to be very careful when we talk about medical conditions that are harms related to commercial tobacco and commercial tobacco addiction, and understand that traditional tobacco has an important role in the culture. I'll give you a little bit of background on community-based participatory research. I don't know exactly the degree that this audience has some expertise in this, so I hope I am hitting the right amount of background. One definition of community-based participatory research is an approach to research that involves collective, reflective, and systematic inquiry. Researchers and community stakeholders engage as equal partners in all steps of the process, with the goal of educating, improving the practice, or bringing about social change. Inherently questions the power relationships that are embedded in Western knowledge production. Certainly, we're all part of academia and recognize the hierarchical nature of tenure and assistant professors and full professors and PIs and fellows. Really CBPR is about breaking down all of that hierarchy and advocates for the sharing of power equally between the researcher and the researched. And it acknowledges the legitimacy of experiential knowledge and focuses on research aimed at improving situations and practices. This type of approach is particularly useful when working on populations who've been historically marginalized, because it supports respectful relationships in these groups and trying to repair generations of mistrust. Other terms for CBPR, or some related concepts which exist on a spectrum: community engaged research, community-based research, community-placed research, community partnership, participatory action research, community-based participatory action research. I found this quote from an article in 2006, which I think, didn't age well, but I think it still describes in some ways the attitudes that researchers may have about this type of work. For academics, the dilemma arises in the use of PAR, the participatory action research, because it is time consuming and unpredictable, unlikely to lead to a high production of articles in refereed journals, and its somewhat messy nature means it's less likely to attract competitive research funding. So I cringe a little bit to see that and read it, but I think that this probably still describes the attitudes of some individuals. The good news is that I think some of the journals and research funding have changed to value this much more now. So now it's kind of a hot topic that people want to get into, but that doesn't mean that it is not a little bit more time circuitous and a little bit more messy than doing, a randomized clinical trial in a totally controlled setting on subjects. This is from the University of Minnesota's Program in Health Disparities Research. They've got quite a few resources, and I'll share more of those later. And basically describing some of the spectrum of community-based research. So community-based research would be sort of, or community-placed research would be kind of the most basic. The research exists in the community, and other stakeholders are identified and basically informed and invited to give feedback. A basic partnership would include all of that, plus you might disseminate research findings to those stakeholders. A close community partnership research would, build upon that foundation by developing the procedures together with the community partners, and so on and so forth. So this is the community-based participatory research is everything on that last slide, plus this. So the idea is like we said, a truly equal partnership in all phases of the project. So that is from inception to study design, to data collection, to data analysis and interpretation and dissemination of findings. So the Minnesota Precision Medicine Grand Challenge is an initiative at the University of Minnesota, started in late 2016. And the idea is to bring innovative 21st century technologies to tailor healthcare for individuals in Minnesota and those communities. So in the first round of the Minnesota Precision Medicine Challenge, there were several projects. And so one of them was a lung cancer project. And that is one I'll tell you a little bit more about. I'll work with that project. So we also collaborated with the Minnesota Cancer Clinical Trials Network, which you may know about, and their aims are to improve cancer outcomes for all Minnesotans through greater access to cancer clinical trials. So the idea is to develop the capacity for clinical trials in outstate Minnesota to reach individuals who may not otherwise have access to clinical trials, and to improve representation of the greater Minnesota populations in clinical research. This is a paper that I know a couple of the authors. I see you guys on the participant list. Hello, Dr. Carol, Dr. Hatsukami. Our friend and collaborator, Carol Hernandez, again, is listed here. And we summarized some of our experience working with a central Minnesota tribe to provide a bit of a guide map for other individuals interested in doing specifically genetic research and personalized medicine. So again, this is community-based participatory research principles, along with specific guidelines for working with American Indian populations, understanding tribal governance and its structure, building trust in the community, spending time in the community, getting to know people and understanding the culture, exercising a lifelong pursuit of becoming culturally attuned, which involves openness to other cultures and humility, being straightforward with expectations. So these are some of the recommendations that we want to share based on our experience. I'm realizing now I probably should have placed this slide a little bit later in the talk, but this is one of the outcomes of the work that we did. So this was one of our lung cancer demonstration projects that was the one that I was specifically asked to talk about today. The title of the paper is Evidence that Established Lung Cancer Mortality Disparities in American Indians Are Not Due to Lung Cancer Genetic Testing and Targeted Therapy Disparities. So our objective was to describe lung cancer epidemiology in Minnesota American Indians and Alaska Natives. And also the primary outcome was rate of EGFR mutational analysis testing amongst cases and controls. So I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Guidelines recommend mutation analysis of all lung cancer that is not small cell, not squamous cell. So that's why I told you about that stuff in the beginning. The first recommendation for this type of testing came out in 2009, and it was specifically for one type of mutation called EGFR, epidermal growth factor receptor, in lung cancer. Subsequently, there are quite a few other recommended testing, but we're going to focus on EGFR today. At the time, as I mentioned, 2016 is when we started this project. At that time, this was the only recommended testing and had been established for several years. So we wanted to look at EGFR testing in lung cancer in American Indians in Minnesota. So initially, we discussed our study plan with some Minnesota American Indian communities and leaders throughout the state. We established collaborators and co-investigators at several large Minnesota healthcare systems. We identified lung cancer cases in patients who identified as American Indian and Alaska Native in large Minnesota healthcare systems. And we also identified matched controls from each institution. And then we assessed for evidence of EGFR mutation testing, and if any mutations were tested, if any treatments were offered based on the test results. So, our rationale was that many American Indians may be getting healthcare from local tribal clinics rather than large healthcare systems, but most likely any lung cancer treatment would be taking place in a tertiary referral center. So this is your Mayo, Essentia, mHealth Fairview, Hennepin, Sanford Health, the large healthcare systems. And because EGFR testing is recommended for all non-small cell, non-squamous cell lung cancer, regardless of smoking status, this would be one place where we think that the guideline is pretty clear that it should apply to everybody. And so hopefully there would not be disparities in that testing. And, there is some sensitivity around genetic testing in some Indigenous communities, which partly has to do with whether or not, genetically origins may be tracked to one tribal community or another, and whether that would place in question, an individual's identity. So that's part of the genetic testing sensitivity. But we thought EGFR would probably not be susceptible to that, because this is somatic mutation testing, which is done usually on a tissue sample, and it's not the sort of thing that patients are asked about or provide consent for. It's usually a reflex testing that the lab and a cancer specialist would be making that determination amongst themselves. So this is a table from our paper. Our numbers are pretty small, but as I mentioned, the numbers of American Indians in Minnesota are pretty small. And so in order to do work, I think you have to acknowledge that smaller numbers is going to be necessary. So of our sites, we identified 164 cases. These are American Indians with lung cancer throughout Minnesota, and then matched controls for smoking status and histology and sex. And there had been some publications showing that histology in American Indians, the distribution of histology may vary a little bit compared to national numbers, but we found that the distribution of different types of histology of lung cancer was not very different from in the case and controls and from national numbers. So we looked at testing rates over time. Remember, this is a test that should be for all non-small cell, non-squamous cell lung cancer. So looking at all of those testing rates, quite low in the beginning. The original guideline was published in 2009. So of course that makes sense. And over time, testing rates increased. At the time of the study, even patients who were several years out, their cancer diagnosis was several years out from the original guideline, in some institutions were still getting low rates of testing, which if there are any implementation scientists in the room, you won't necessarily be surprised by the fact that it takes time for implementation of these types of guidelines. So these are the findings that we had of our cases who were non-small cell lung cancer adenocarcinoma. So this would basically be the type of people who should be getting the testing. Squamous cell, for example, would not be recommended for mutational analysis. So in short, we did not find a difference between EGFR mutation testing in cases and controls, which is good. Again, these numbers are very small, so this is not at all powered to find any other significant differences, but you can see that more of the cases were tested for EGFR than in controls, but we actually had fewer where the mutation was detected. These are a few other mutations which at that time were not recommended for routine testing, have since been adopted because there are targeted therapies available to address the ALK-ROS1 KRAS mutations. One thing that I found interesting, again, really small numbers, but if you are familiar at all with lung cancer, you probably recognize that KRAS is one of the mutations which has typically been associated with really poor outcomes in lung cancer. And so even only 3 of the cases, so these would be the American Indians with lung cancer, were tested. 2 of them did have a mutation detected, whereas 5 of the controls were tested and there were no mutations detected. So this kind of stuck out to me, knowing what I know about the disparities in mortality from lung cancer. KRAS also has been associated with commercial tobacco use, so I don't suppose that's too surprising. In terms of targeted mutation therapy, by the way, EGFR was recommended at this time because there were EGFR targets available for testing. There actually, as of this year, is now a KRAS targeted therapy for KRAS mutations that is available now. So that is wonderful news. So the caveats, limitations of this study: a really small study size, using the electronic health record, which is how we got this information, to identify American Indians and Alaska Natives may be inaccurate. Racial classifications in electronic health records are not always perfect, to say the least. And, you know, even going into the study, we recognize that EGFR mutations is undoubtedly a small contributor to American Indians and the burden of lung cancer in this population. However, it was at the time, you know, sort of the most widely available and evidence-based format to identify, you know, personalized or precision medicine in this population. So that's why it was chosen. So in conclusion, we did not see a difference in testing rates. If anything, the cases actually had higher rates of testing of EGFR mutation. Possibly there was difference in the rates of detection of mutations, as I mentioned, the EGFR and KRAS. 7 patients, this was not shown in the tables. I think we probably had some missing data here. 7 patients were actually prescribed targeted therapy in mostly the cases. So even though we didn't see a disparity in testing, the data would suggest there may have been a disparity in access to the targeted therapies. Almost all of the people who received targeted therapies, which were only 7, were cases. So perhaps that represents a disparate access to treatment. And the overall epidemiology with regard to histology distribution is similar to national data. So my question for the audience, oh, let's see, I see something in the chat here. Might have missed it, but the controls were all non-Native American individuals with lung cancer, same healthcare. Yes, that's right. They were predominantly white. We asked for white controls. I think one institution gave us a mix of non-American Indian individuals, but for the most part, they were all white. So my question for the audience is, was this project community-based participatory research? Was it community-placed participatory research? Was it community-engaged research? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Okay, no, it was not. So let's see. Engaged. Dana, thanks, Dana. Dana says maybe it was community engaged. Not really. Basically, this project was a project that we conceived of as part of the Minnesota Precision Medicine Challenge. And we discussed the study design with some leaders that we were collaborating with and developing relationships with. But, you know, this research did not take place in the community. This research took place in the electronic health records and medical records of large healthcare systems. We certainly did not engage any community members in the study design. We certainly did not engage them in the, you know, data collection. So this really was not in any way community engaged research. Now, I will say that this was, for me, my getting my foot in the door towards working on community engaged research, which I'll shift a little bit more of that work now. So the American Indian Cancer Foundation has been a really great research partner for us. They're a locally based organization. This is from their website. We believe Native communities have the wisdom to find the solutions for cancer inequities, but are seeking organizational capacity, expert input, and the resources to do so. So we support innovative and community-based interventions that engage Native populations in the discovery of their own cancer best practices. We strive to be a partner trusted by tribal and urban community leaders, healthcare providers and others working towards effective and sustainable cancer solutions. So American Indian Cancer Foundation is really working to facilitate more community engaged or community partnership research by harnessing the wisdom of Native communities and seeking expert input. So we're the experts giving the input, but we're not running the show. That's the idea. So some more engaged work that I've done, I'll give you a little bit of background. Lung cancer screening with the low-dose CT annually has been recommended since 2013 for older individuals who have smoked cigarettes, commercial tobacco for many years. Uptake is poor nationally. Very little is known about American Indians, Alaska Natives, and lung cancer screening. There's research known about other cancer screenings, but very little about American Indians and lung cancer screening. And as I mentioned, there is a sensitivity around this because if people, especially in this region of Anishinaabe and Dakota backgrounds, have a concept that tobacco is healing and is a spiritual and medicinal properties, linking that to the development of lung cancer could potentially be problematic if the topic is not handled with some care. So I partnered with an urban clinic who serves American Indian and Alaska Native patients, and the American Indian Cancer Foundation, so that we established a relationship with the clinic and their leadership to identify common goals for this project. So they agreed, yes, lung cancer is a problem in their clinic, and yes, they would like to improve lung cancer screening uptake in their clinic and implementation in their clinic. We developed a research plan and a protocol together. And this requires, flexibility and compromise from our parts as well. So from the regulatory perspective, from dealing with the IRB, from the perspective of, what makes the most clean research study with, randomizing patients versus what is practical and what is the right thing to do in the community. So it requires a lot of flexibility and compromise to honor and respect the community and the clinic, as well as the scientific goals. So this is our timeline. There are a whole bunch of asterisks in here, but to give you a sense of the time frame of this project, in February of 2019, we submitted a proposal to the SEARCH program, which is an internal community engaged research community health program. This was co-sponsored by myself and the American Indian Cancer Foundation. We received the award as an 18-month funding cycle, 18-month grant in June of 2019. At that time, we were actually planning to work with a rural tribal clinic. And shortly after we received the funding, the director of the clinic, pulled out of the project. I didn't want to participate anymore. So we had to look around to find some new collaborators. So with the help of ACAF, we did find an urban clinic to transition the project there. We worked on, of course, securing regulatory approval and formalizing the partnership through the summer and fall. In November of 2019, so we're already a third of the way through the grant project, we initiated our AIM-1 data collection, which was qualitative data, and completed that, worked on that over the next few months, took longer than anticipated. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic came along, which shut down research operations. The clinic was closed. In-person visits were no longer available. Lung cancer screening CTs were halted because it's an elective procedure. So then, just as we were attempting to recover from that, in May of 2020, civil unrest and the death of, George Floyd, his name got deleted as I was trying to make room on the page. Sorry about that, George. Impacted many community organizations and their ability to participate in research. So then in the summer of 2020, we were approaching the end of our funding time and had not completed our project objectives. So we applied for some additional funding, again, internal funding through the Programs and Health Disparities Research, and to continue working on our lung cancer screening project at the Urban Clinic partner. In the fall of 2020, we were expecting lung cancer screening exams to occur. However, we continued to experience IRB difficulties. So the IRB essentially declined to oversee this project because it was taking place outside of the university. So we had to switch to receiving an external IRB. So we got that in the summer of 2021. And we essentially started our aim 2, which was our interventional aim, in October of 2021. So the timeline got quite a bit stretched out. Some of those things were probably due to the nature of community research. Some of those things were due to the unprecedented events that happened in 2020. So the timeline was quite elongated. So these are the aims for the second project, but represent a much more community partnership type of project. And specifically, I want to highlight an aim 2, where we talk about including access to traditional healing practices through the clinic with their elders and residents, and holistic medicine approaches. So these were contributions to the aims that I did not come up with. These are contributions to the aims that were from the community partners. So this was truly a much more equal partnership than the first couple of projects. So in terms of my timeline and my progress as a researcher who does community-based participatory action research, in 2016, I was invited to join this Minnesota Precision Medicine project. We developed an idea. We sought community feedback, but as I mentioned, is not truly community engaged. It was kind of like community consented, community permitted. And part of the reason for that is that because we were not doing this in a specific tribe, there was no specific tribal leadership to get approval of. If we're looking at individuals throughout all of Minnesota who were receiving treatment for lung cancer, we were not able to ascertain if there was any tribal affiliation or relationship for those individual patients. So this was more of a, in general, community idea. In 2018, I would say that project, the search project, was probably community-based research, but ultimately this was a project that I developed with the American Indian Cancer Foundation input, and we worked on it together. And then we went to the clinic and said, hey, we have this project, can we implement it in your clinic? So that's really not truly, we were not equal partners. We showed up with a preconceived project and said, can we do this in your clinic? And then when we reapplied for funding to complete the project, that one was more of a close partnership, where we worked very closely on developing the aims and determining what the project was going to look like. So my next step, hopefully, is going to be to do a true community-based participatory action research project where the community defines the need. In all of these projects, I had something I'm interested in studying, something I think is a problem, and brought it to the community to engage their participation in studying it. But in a truly CBPAR project, the community would actually define the need and determine the research questions. So, this work has taught me patience and humility, and that science and medicine are not the only ways of knowing, and really given me, I just can't even put it into words, a deeper understanding of my patients, both the patients that I take care of in the clinic, as well as patients who are also research participants. Here are some resources from the University of Minnesota. Has several of these resources on the website, their PhDR website, for community engaged work, a research partner checklist and a protocol, and some training curricula, both for university faculty as well as the community partner scholars. And I think that's all I have here. So I would love to have some discussion. We've got plenty of time, and I hope we can have some vibrant discussion, questions.
Great, thank you so much, Abbie. If people want to ask a question, you can either type it into the Q&A. Otherwise, you can raise your hand, and we'd be happy to unmute you to ask your question.
Thank you, Dana. Dr. Carroll says, do you think the lack of genetic testing generalizes to other states? I think what you're asking is whether or not other states also have low rates of recommended testing in, I'm not sure if you mean in American Indians or in everyone. I think probably yes. You know, again, at that time, it was just a few years from the recommendation, and unfortunately, these things frequently do take time to be implemented. Even the lack of testing disparity. I do. I think the nature of genetic testing for lung cancer is that most of the time it should be happening on more of a reflex basis. That really does vary. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the oncology and pathology communities about how we do that testing. In some institutions, it is reliant upon an individual medical oncologist to order the testing, but I think increasingly it is standardized. So should be happening, at the level of the lab, at the time of the biopsy, when certain features are seen on the histology. So I think the genetic testing disparity probably is a real finding that it's not there. Now, the question of access to care, whether or not individuals get a biopsy, is another question. I think amongst patients who get biopsies for their cancers, probably, yes, they're being tested the same as, their white counterparts, for example, although probably none of them are being tested at 100% based on what's recommended. But I think access to biopsies and, cancer detection, and also access to the targeted treatments is, there probably are disparities there. But I think for people who get biopsies, they probably are getting the genetic testing at the same rates as everyone else is. Dr. Hatsukami says, have you considered partnering with Dr. Carroll and linking lung cancer screening with culturally sensitive smoking cessation with the input of the community? Yes, I think we have. We certainly have talked at least generally about it. I don't know that we don't have a project right now where we link those two things, but we definitely should. Clement Wilcox says, how is community impacting your research? Is there feedback similar among communities? Do you take a different approach with each community? I think in terms of how it impacts the research, I would say it's actually so profound, it's almost hard to even remember, where we were 5 years ago and how much of a change things have made. On a regular basis, when I am talking with my community partners and individuals with ACAF, and we're talking about the whether it's the study design or the data interpretation, we will just see things so differently that I mean, despite working in this area for years, it's like something I somehow still failed to even anticipate was going to be a difference. And so it's actually, I mean, it's like this whole other world that you don't even maybe recognize as existing. I mean, I'm speaking as a person who's not a part of an Indigenous community, so there are so many things that are just beyond my recognition that right now we're analyzing the data from our qualitative study. And so we're going through transcripts of individuals who would be eligible for lung cancer screening, and like what they think about screening and their approach to it. And the things that are being said are things that I just would have never considered. I mean, I think it on a daily basis, it's really humbling. I've been working in lung cancer screening for 8 years now, and I sort of consider myself an expert, and I just like, wow, there's so many, whether it's ideas about lung cancer screening or concerns about lung cancer screening, or feelings about it that are things that I just never entertained. So it's almost so immense that I barely can even describe how it has impacted the research. I think in terms of feedback similar amongst communities, I'm not sure that I can answer that. Most of the work that I've done has where we got detailed feedback has been with the urban community. I think that there will be some similarities, but probably some differences. One thing I'll say about that is that when we started doing this work back in 2016, and we started you know, talking to people and trying to learn a little bit and start to understand, you know, the culture and what potential pitfalls we were going to have and what potential concerns people were going to have. So one of them for example, was, you know, genetic testing. And I think we found that, you know, individuals don't always identify with the beliefs that supposedly their group endorses, right? I mean, whether you want to talk about individuals who, you know, maybe say, well, whatever's meant to be is meant to be. And, you know, I'm not gonna, you know, like if the culture says, okay, like this is what it is, I don't need to try to change it by, let's say, treating my lung cancer or getting it removed. But then you have an individual person in front of you and their perspective is very different. So I think the answer there is that generalizing is really quite dangerous. I think in terms of approach to each community, this is, you know, something certainly Dr. Carroll's paper talks a little bit about. I mean, I think there are some similarities in terms of the humility and the cultural attunement and going in with an open mind and trying to understand what concerns there are, what's the history with research, what's the history with the specific topic of research that you're interested in looking at. But I'm just starting to explore doing some of this kind of work in some Muslim communities in Minnesota. And so I'm sitting down and trying to, like, okay, you know, kind of answer the basic questions. You know, what are the attitudes about cigarette smoking in this community? What are the attitudes about cancer screening? What are the attitudes about health promoting behaviors? So I think to some degree, the approach with all communities might be at a foundational level kind of similar, but you're definitely going to have very different pivot points, pressure points in different communities. Let's see. What is the most important thing the university and or cancer center could do to better support this kind of research? Well, I mean, you know, MNCCTN has been really, really helpful and really has supported us. I think probably helping to establish these links, the partnerships. I mean, I consider myself very fortunate that I sort of fell into this initial project and that, you know, American Indian Cancer Foundation has been absolutely crucial. So I think whatever we can do to facilitate linking up researchers with communities, that is important. And then, of course, you know, sort of before we let any of our researchers at community organizations who are interested in doing research, make sure that they've been through at a minimum a crash course in the principles and, you know, cultural attunement, because I think it's not, you know, humility and openness to other ways of knowing is not exactly something that's inherent to, you know, academia. Let's see, Raina, is the commercial tobacco versus traditional tobacco issue seen with other AI populations is specific to Minnesota? So this really varies. I mean, you know, there are a lot of different indigenous cultures and traditions in this region, the Northern Plains with the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe and Dakota. Traditional tobacco is a really important part of the culture. In other areas, that's not the case. So, you know, for example, in the Southwest, it's much less of an issue. And so if you look at cancer disparities in different regions of the country, you're going to see very different things. In this place, in Minnesota and Northern Plains area, we have high rates of lung cancer disparities. In other parts of the country where the indigenous peoples there do not have tobacco as part of their culture, they have lower rates of lung cancer. So this also speaks to the issue of, you know, the national numbers don't tell you what's happening on the local level. So especially with indigenous peoples, you cannot generalize to other regions or other cultures. Let's see. Did you consider any input or support from the state's cancer registry, the Minnesota Cancer Reporting System? We have population-based information on virtually all cancers diagnosed in Minnesota residents. We could help you identify cases. No, this is the first I'm hearing of this service. I'm going to write this down. Julie Ostrander says, is it common to have external IRB approval for this community engaged research? Can you tell us more about that process? Oh boy. I don't know if any of my partners who were involved in that and are here want to talk about it, but this has been a bit of an issue. So I know that a lot of people at the university who do community engaged research from the Cancer Center and from the Program in Health Disparities Research and MNCCTN have been working through the university to try to remedy this, because it's really a major barrier. External IRBs are rather expensive, and the process was really difficult and really frustrating and expensive. And I did it with the help of MNCCTN. And I don't know if we have any updates on that. I know that you guys were basically, lobbying the powers that be to see if we can make things change. But to my knowledge, nothing has changed yet on that. So that was really a major concern. Some tribal organizations are large enough and do enough research that they have their own IRB, which would probably be ideal. My community partners that I've worked with, we actually reached out to a couple of other organizations nationally that do work with Indian people, and they have, basically an Indian IRB, which really would be the most appropriate, because that's really the organization that's going to be best at overseeing some of the ethical considerations that the university IRB may not even really consider. So I don't know what else I can add about that, other than it's a kind of a major problem right now for community engaged research. Let's see, we have chat questions. Okay, so Raina put her contact information as the regulatory manager, Raina Lead, for MNCCTN, who's worked on this for several projects, and she gave her email address for anybody there who wants to take a look at that. Thank you very much, Raina. And then Dr. Carroll says, do any of your patients raise concerns about radon exposure given Minnesota levels can be high? Do you think this is an opportunity for future collaboration? Smoking and radon seem to interact to really increase lung cancer. So radon is a huge problem. Many people in Minnesota do not even seem to have this on their radar, no pun intended. And it's a tricky problem to solve. There are regulations now in place, I think, for at the time of a home sale, that a home gets tested for radon. And so that's happening now. And people are discovering that the home that they've been living in for however many decades has high radon levels, and then they have to mitigate it if they want to sell the home. But that does not apply to people who are not buying and selling homes. So I think radon exposure is a huge problem. It's not something that most people are aware of. I mean, I routinely ask my patients if they know about radon exposure, and I would say 1 in 10 do not look at me like I'm an alien. Like, most of them do not know what I am talking about. So radon is a tricky problem because the Minnesota Department of Health does offer programs for testing, but mitigation is really expensive. And if you talk about people who don't own their homes and who are living in rental properties, there's really no protections for these individuals. I mean, if you live in an apartment building that has high radon levels, there's really no recourse. You don't have a way of requiring your landlord to remedy the problem. So this is a really serious problem and a really difficult one. I'm certainly open to anybody has any insight on how we can do that. I mean, I think it would probably have to start with some policy and advocacy work. All right, good job. You guys got me talking for 20 extra minutes.
That was great. Thank you. And I just, we are actually working on some radon work in the 10,000 family study. So I'd be happy to talk more about, kind of trying to brainstorm. And actually, Clement Wilcox just put in the chat, we're actually having a Facebook Live with the head of the indoor air pollution unit at MDH on January 19th, just to kind of have a public discussion and information about radon and radon testing. Yeah. So everyone is obviously welcome for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think radon is a huge disparities issue because fixing it is really expensive.
Right. I mean, that's what we're really struggling with. We don't want to go out and test people's homes and not have a plan for what to do. Right. Have high levels. So yeah, exactly. It's something we're struggling with as well. So we'd be happy to to discuss and brainstorm with you if you're interested.
Yes.
Yeah, and if there aren't any additional questions, just thank you very much for the great seminar and all of the great discussion.
Thank you for all the fabulous questions and the opportunity.
And I think this was the last seminar of the year, so I hope everyone has a great holiday, and we'll see everyone back in 2022.